Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's wonderful to have you with us today. We're exploring a passage from John's Gospel in which Jesus offers the first of the 7 I am sayings that punctuate this Gospel by declaring himself to be the bread of life. Before we get to that, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You'll find the link for that just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of the reading that we're looking at today, some questions that we'll ponder together later on, suggestions for other Bible passages you may find it helpful to look up, and plenty of space for you to record your own observations and thoughts. So without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from John's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 24 to 35. Jesus is in Galilee, where we're told that significant crowds of people had flocked to him because of the signs he was performing by healing the sick. And we know from earlier in this chapter that he'd fed 5,000 men and an unnumbered the constituency of women and children with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's in verses 1 to 15. And we know that all were satisfied, all had their fill in this remarkable meal. At the end of that episode, however, some in the crowd had desired to make Jesus their king by force, and so he had sidestepped and slipped away from their nationalist agenda that they desired to push upon him by retreating up into the mountains, as verse 15 tells us, to be alone with God. And that same evening, we learn in verses 16 to 23 that Jesus had miraculously crossed the Sea of Galilee. And the next day, some boats arrived where the disciples and Jesus had been from Tiberias. And seeing that Jesus and the disciples weren't there, and knowing Jesus hadn't been in the boat with his disciples, the people got into them and sailed over to Capernaum, looking for Jesus and his disciples. And as we learn in verse 24, arguably seeking out another substantial meal. So who have we got highlighted in this text then? Well, principally we have Jesus, who is very much in teaching mode here and challenging the crowds to look past the immediate, the desire of their bellies, and instead recognise him as one sent by God, as verse 29 puts it. And we also have the crowds who were, as Jesus points out to them in verse 26, primarily there because they wanted a free meal, and who were asking for some sort of sign or wonder or work to confirm Jesus' identity to them, as we'll see when we think about verse 30. So there's a lot of people in a very busy scene. And this scene comes in John's Gospel, which was the last to be written, around 90 to 95 of the Common Era. And one of the unique features of John's Gospel is that it contains 7 I am sayings in which Jesus makes very powerful declarations about who he is. And it's also the case that in the first 11 chapters of John's Gospel, in its first half really, signs and wonders are a really key theme, key motif, before the focus then switches later on as we progress closer to the cross, to the glorification of Jesus at Calvary. And so what we're looking at here is very much discussion, debate, maybe confrontation between Jesus and the crowds. And in the background to this, it's important to note, as we did last week, Exodus chapter 16, and how the people of Israel who had been enabled to escape from oppression in Egypt by God, they were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years and complaining about their lack of food to their leader Moses. And God answered that desire and quelled their moans by sending manna from heaven that the people could eat. and they were able to gather enough every day to fill their bellies to have their fill. That's very much in the background of today's passage. So, as we've already thought a bit about, the crowds decide to seek out Jesus and the disciples who'd left the mountainous region where the feeding of the 5,000 had occurred and headed over to Capernaum. Verses 23 and 24 show us that. And the disciples hadn't been, as I mentioned, in the same boat as Jesus, as we see in verse 22. And so our reading begins with the crowds wondering how it was that Jesus had got to Capernaum and when he got there, bearing in mind he'd not set off with his disciples in the one boat that they were using to travel. Now, seeking out Jesus is one of those double-edged kind of ideas that we see in John's Gospel. It can be a very positive thing, as when people sought out Jesus with the intention of becoming disciples, as we saw in chapter 1, verses 39 onwards. But it can also be negative, as we see, for example, in chapter 7, verse 1, where religious leaders were seeking out Jesus in order to try and harm him, in order to try and kill him. The true motivation of the crowd in this seeking out is called out very much by Jesus in verse 26, where he says, basically, you're here for the free food, aren't you? And it's a reminder of how we've already seen at various points thus far in John's Gospel of how signs in of themselves are not enough to provoke a genuine faith. More has to happen in the heart of the believer than just seeing amazing and unusual things. And in the light of Jesus' knowing what was on their hearts, they're challenged to get beyond just seeking the material and instead focusing, as we learn in the first part of verse 27, on what gives eternal life. And moreover, this comes from the Son of Man, as we see in verse 27 in its second part, which was Jesus' favourite title for himself and has all sorts of Old Testament resonances to do with the salvation of God's people. It makes it clear that Jesus was a lot more than the rabbi that he's described as by the crowds in verse 25 when they're puzzled by how he's got to be where he currently is. There's more to learn even than that, though, from verse 27, because we see in the third part of it that Jesus is the one on whom God has set the divine seal. A bit like a monarch might give a great seal on any of their correspondence, or someone might give their seal of approval to a particular product they like when they endorse it. And it reveals not just something of who Jesus is, but the authority that he embodies as one who is doing things that only God was otherwise able to do. Now, the crowd kind of talk past Jesus. They don't really respond to what he's just said in verse 28. And so Jesus calls them back again to the primary stuff that he wants to talk about. And the demand that God was making on the people meant that they would need a complete change of heart if they were going to truly get what Jesus was saying. And they needed to recognize that the same God who had been at work in the Exodus story was indeed at work in Jesus. The crowd then, having been prompted again by Jesus, almost with Jesus trying to put them back on the right track as it were, ask him for a sign. And I think this is a little bit odd because they'd already had the sign of the feeding of the 5,000. And so it begs the question, what's going on in verses 30 and 31? Was this a disingenuous request of Jesus, almost treating him like a performing monkey? Was this yet more evidence that no amount of signs and wonders would be adequate to enable people to believe, which is an interesting point given some theologies that float around in today's world? Or was it that they had particular ideas about what kind of things they wanted Jesus to do? Maybe those things that had motivated them to try and force him to be their king, maybe they were looking for some sort of military act against the Romans. We don't know for sure, but we do know that in verse 31 there's a negative comparison that's drawn between Jesus and Moses, basically comparing the feeding of the 5,000 with the falling of the manna from heaven, but in a pejorative way, and citing a midrash, a kind of later interpretation of Exodus 16 in that little quote that is given to justify what they're saying. Now, Jesus doesn't answer their demand for a sign here, but instead he points out to them in verse 32 that it wasn't actually Moses who was responsible for the manna from heaven. Moses was merely God's agent, kind of the conduit for this, and rather it was God who had acted to sustain Israel in a way that enabled them to keep their faith and their life going, even in the midst of really challenging times. And Jesus makes that point to them in verse 33. Now note in verse 32 that we've got the present tense here in relation to the bread that comes from the Father. This implies that this is an ongoing process. It isn't simply something historical and in the past. And it tries to bring people back to Jesus and the essential point that he's trying to make to the crowd. Because you see, that miraculous sign that had drawn them back to him again on the other side of the lake, the feeding of the 5,000, just one of 7 signs that we see in John's Gospel, was not the end point itself. Rather, it truly was a sign in the sense of being a signpost, directing them to something beyond itself. In this case, the point that the food that was being offered by Jesus of the Son of Man was actually Jesus himself as the bread of life, as verse 35 puts it. And what matters here is not what Jesus can do for someone, but fundamentally who Jesus is. And that's what these signs are for and about. They're trying to show us fully who Jesus is. In verse 34, the crowd offer a prayer, give us this bread always, that we may well want to pray ourselves today as we look for true nourishment from God. And it mirrors what we find in chapter 4, verse 15, when the Samaritan woman at the well asks to be given the living water always, so that she will never be thirsty. At this stage, though, I think, like the woman at the well, the crowds had failed in their request to truly grasp what Jesus was saying. I think, bearing in mind what we'll see as we look further into this section next week, that their minds were still on their bellies and this idea of never having to find food again, just like the woman at the well had wanted the living water so that she wouldn't have to go and draw water ever again and deal with the daily stigma of that. So there's still an awful lot more for the crowds to learn. But in Jesus's first I am saying in verse 35, which was repeated again in verses 48 and 51, such is its importance, we have a really important statement that's being made about God. I am the bread of life. Jesus is the bread of life, that which nourishes and sustains. And note, given the concern that Jesus displays time and again in John's Gospel for practical justice, this encompasses, I think, the need for physical nourishment, sustenance, as well as spiritual. I think it's an all-encompassing vision of nourishment that Jesus is attaching to himself here, revealing to the crowds. And crowds who, as we read on, will discover, go on to reject Jesus. We'll see in verses 60 to 65 of this chapter. Something that's balanced out to a degree by the fragile faith of the disciples that we see in verses 66 to 71. So there's a lot going on in this passage, and there's a lot more yet to explore in chapter 6 that will continue to think about Jesus as the bread of life and what that means and looks like. But for today, we have some really interesting questions to ponder about why it was that the crowds were seeking out Jesus and their motives, and how we respond to people's needs today in the most appropriate ways, and things like where we find nourishment, what nourishment truly means for us.